How does a country on its knees with no jobs and no hope not only get back on its feet, but build one of the most formidable war machines the world had ever seen, practically overnight? The standard story is one of a miracle, a dark, cursed miracle, but a miracle nonetheless. Today, I want to challenge that story, because when you pull back the curtain on the so-called Nazi economic miracle, you don't find magic. You don't even find genius. What you find is a brutal, desperate, and fundamentally fragile cheat code for an economy. And the man who wrote that code wasn't a lifelong Nazi fanatic. He was a respected banker, a former liberal, a pragmatist. His name was Hjalmar Schacht, and his story is a masterclass in how intelligent people make catastrophic deals with power, believing they can control forces that are, in the end, uncontrollable. Before we begin, please note that this video is an educational and analytical discussion of historical economic policy and geopolitics. It is based on publicly available information, archival records, and historical scholarship. It reflects analysis and opinion and does not promote violence, hate, or glorify extremist ideologies. I am not offering investment, legal, or financial advice here. My goal is to understand the mechanics of history so we can better recognize their echoes. So let's start with the central contradiction. Hjalmar Schacht himself. In 1923, he was the savior of the Weimar Republic, the man who helped stop the hyperinflation that had made currency literally worthless. He was a co-founder of the center-left German Democratic Party, a liberal. By 1933, he was accepting an appointment from Adolf Hitler as president of the Reichsbank, Germany's central bank. By 1934, he was the Minister of Economics. Why? What makes a sober establishment banker sign on with a radical violent movement? The answer isn't ideology. It's what Schacht perceived as necessity. See, from Schacht's perspective, the liberal democratic Weimar system had failed. It was paralyzed. It was, in his view, unable to defend Germany's core interests, particularly against the crushing war reparations imposed after World War I. His disillusionment grew through the early 1930s. He watched the Great Depression hit, unemployment soar back up to 6 million, and the moderate governments respond with austerity, a deliberate crushing of the economy to save the state's finances. To Schacht, this was madness. So in 1931, he did something shocking for a man of his background. He stood on a platform with Adolf Hitler at a far-right rally, criticizing the Weimar government. He wasn't a Nazi, but he saw in the Nazis, and specifically in their promise to restore German power and overturn the post-war order, a vehicle for his own economic project, a strong, independent, and respected Germany. When Hitler was appointed chancellor in 1933, he immediately asked Schacht to lead the Reichsbank. For Hitler, it was a brilliant move. It sent a signal to the terrified German business elite and the international community. See, a responsible banker is in charge. Things will be normal here. For Schacht, it was the opportunity of a lifetime. He could finally implement his ideas without the constraints of a bickering democracy. The deal was struck. The liberal became the engine of the dictatorship. And this is where we see the first critical lesson. Autocrats often need technocrats, and technocrats often convince themselves that their expertise can temper the autocrat's worst impulses. It is almost always a fatal miscalculation. Schacht got to work immediately on what was called the New Plan. On the surface, it looked familiar, even respectable. It was massive government spending on public works, roads, hospitals, the famous Autobahn network. It was, in essence, what Franklin Roosevelt was doing with the New Deal in America, using state investment to create jobs and stimulate demand. And it worked. Unemployment plummeted. The soup kitchens of 1933 vanished by 1939. But here's the first layer of the trick. This wasn't just a jobs program. It was, from the very beginning, a rearmament program in disguise. Hitler was desperate to rebuild the German military, but this was blatantly illegal under the Treaty of Versailles. He feared Allied intervention if it was discovered too soon. So Schacht engineered a financial shell game. He created a phantom company called the Metallurgical Research Company, Mefo. This company, which was really just a front for the Reich Ministry of Defense, would place huge orders with German arms manufacturers, Krupp, Siemens, and others. But instead of paying with regular Reichsmarks from the budget, it paid with special Mefo bills. These bills were essentially IOUs. The arms makers could then sell these IOUs to the Reichsbank, Schacht's own central bank, for real cash, So the government was borrowing massively to fund arms production, but the debt was kept off the official state ledgers. It was hidden in the shadows of the banking system. To the outside world and to most Germans, it just looked like a booming peacetime economy. This is our second lesson. Miracles that rely on accounting tricks are not miracles. They are time bombs. The Mefo system allowed Germany to rearm at a breakneck speed without immediately triggering hyperinflation or an international crisis. But it was creating a mountain of hidden short-term debt that would eventually come due. Now let's pause on a crucial economic problem. When you pump this much money into an economy and unemployment disappears, classic economics tells you what happens next. Workers have more power, they demand higher wages. Companies seeing huge demand raise their prices. The result is inflation. But the Nazis had a visceral political fear of inflation. The memory of 1923, when people needed wheelbarrows of cash to buy a loaf of bread, was a national trauma. Hyperinflation had helped destroy faith in the Weimar Republic. It could not happen again. So Schacht and the regime didn't let it happen. They simply outlawed the natural mechanisms of the economy. First, they abolished independent trade unions. They were replaced by the Nazi-controlled German labor front. But this union's job wasn't to fight for higher wages, it was to prevent wages from rising. So, as the economy boomed, the average German worker's pay remained stagnant. Second, they imposed price controls. The government began dictating the maximum price for an ever-growing list of goods, from textiles to food. Think about what this means. You've unleashed a flood of demand through government spending, but you've capped both the price of goods and the wages of the people buying them. You have, in effect, surgically removed the symptom of inflation from your economic body. But the disease, the overheating, doesn't go away. It just metastasizes. If prices can't rise to balance supply and demand, then something else gives. Shortages. Store shelves empty, quality plummets. A shadow economy of barter and favors emerges. Germans in the mid-1930s had jobs, but they found they couldn't always buy decent clothes or meat or find a new apartment. The economic miracle had a hollow, shoddy quality for the average person. The prosperity was an illusion, diverted to the state's real priority, the military. Before we dive deeper into the fatal flaw in Schacht's plan, I want to take a quick pause to talk about something that's made a real difference in my own routine lately, and that's mom's meals. Like a lot of you, my schedule can get chaotic, and finding the time to prepare nutritious food that actually fits my dietary preferences is a constant challenge. They deliver chef-prepared, ready-to-eat meals right to your door. The options are what really impressed me. They have keto-friendly meals, diabetic-friendly, low-carb, low-cholesterol, halal, vegetarian, and so much more. It's all about convenience without compromising on nutrition, which is perfect for a busy schedule. Prices start from just $7.99 per meal, which is incredibly reasonable for the quality and convenience. I've put the link in the description, and you can get 50% off your first order if you want to try it. All right, let's get back to the story. We now arrive at the core, unsolvable problem that doomed Schacht's entire project and pushed Germany inexorably toward war. It's a problem of geography and resources. Germany, even at full tilt, could not feed its own economic machine. It lacked the vital raw materials for a modern industrial and especially military state: iron ore, copper, nickel, rubber, and above all, oil. This wasn't a new problem. In World War I, the British naval blockade had strangled Germany, contributing massively to its defeat. The Nazi leadership was obsessed with ensuring this never happened again. Their answer was a policy called autarky, total economic self-sufficiency. Schacht's new plan was aimed squarely at this goal. He implemented a brutal system of foreign exchange and import controls. German companies couldn't just buy what they wanted from abroad. They had to petition Schacht's bureaucracy for precious foreign currency, proving their imports were vital for the state's goals, usually rearmament. Consumer goods industries like textiles were starved of imported cotton and wool so that those resources could go to uniforms and explosives. This is why the miracle felt so hollow. The civilian economy was being systematically cannibalized to feed the military one. But here's the brutal truth Schacht, the technocrat, eventually had to face. True autarky was impossible for Germany. It could not be achieved through economic management alone. No amount of clever accounting or import quotas could conjure oil wells in Bavaria or rubber plantations in Brandenburg. This fundamental fact created an unbridgeable rift between Schacht and Hitler. Schacht saw the limits. By 1936, he believed the economy was overheating. The hidden debts were piling up. The shortages were becoming severe. He argued for a pause, a consolidation, a shift toward improving living standards to solidify the gains. He wanted a powerful Germany, but one that existed within a stable, if dominant, European system. Hitler saw the same limits but drew the opposite radical conclusion. If the economy could not provide the resources for the empire he dreamed of, then the empire itself would have to provide the resources. In a secret 1936 memorandum, Hitler laid out his logic. The economy must be wholly geared for war, and the resources would be seized from the lands to the east, from Poland and the Soviet Union. For Hitler, war wasn't an unfortunate risk of policy. It was the logical endpoint of the policy. Conquest was the final solution to the resource crisis. In 1936, Hitler announced the four-year plan with the explicit goal of making Germany ready for total war within 4 years. He put the fanatical Hermann Göring in charge, not the cautious Schacht. The message was clear. The time for financial wizardry was over. The time for plunder was about to begin. Schacht was sidelined, resigning as economics minister in 1937. This is where the real nature of the Nazi economy comes into stark relief. Once Schacht was gone, the mask fell off completely. The economic miracle had always been a pyramid scheme that required constant new inputs. With the peaceful inputs exhausted, the regime turned to violent ones. First, it was plunder. The 1938 annexation of Austria, the Anschluss, wasn't just a political triumph, it was a financial one. Germany seized Austria's gold and foreign currency reserves, giving its own depleted coffers a massive one-time boost. Czechoslovakia was next. Conquest became a form of economic policy. But plunder only gives you a stockpile. To run a perpetual war machine, you need a perpetual flow of labor and materials. And here we encounter the darkest chapter, the one that truly exposes the moral and economic bankruptcy of the system, the massive industrialized use of slave labor. As Germany conquered Europe, it enslaved its population. Historians estimate that by 1944, over 12 million people from across occupied Europe had been used as forced laborers for the Reich. At the peak, foreign forced laborers constituted 20% of the entire German workforce. They worked in the very factories that Albert Speer, Schacht's successor as the overlord of war production, was famously rationalizing. The Nazi regime even had a brutal, racist hierarchy for this labor. Workers from Western Europe might be treated poorly, but those from Poland and the Soviet Union, considered subhuman in Nazi ideology, were worked to death in the most horrific conditions. This wasn't an aberration. It was the system working as designed. As one Nazi official cynically noted, the promise of liberation from Bolshevism had quickly been revealed as a pretext for enslaving Eastern peoples for Germany's benefit. Let's be absolutely clear, by 1943 to 1944, the German war economy was not a testament to Schacht's financial genius or Speer's organizational skills. It was a grotesque, failing enterprise propped up by the systematic theft of continental resources and the consumption of human lives as a fuel source. Any analysis that focuses on production graphs without staring at this human cost is not just incomplete, it's a form of historical complicity. Now, I can anticipate a counter-argument, one that Schacht himself made until his dying day. He was, after all, acquitted of war crimes at the Nuremberg trials, though later convicted by a German court. The defense is this: he was just a technocrat. He was managing the economy. He didn't know about, didn't agree with, and even opposed the worst excesses. He was a patriot trying to restore his country. There is some evidence for this. He did clash with Hitler over the pace of rearmament. He was appalled by the violent, crude anti-Semitism of radicals like Julius Streicher. In fact, in a twisted, horrifying demonstration of his priorities, Schacht sometimes opposed the violent persecution of Jews for purely economic reasons. He feared it would cause capital flight and destabilize the financial system. His objection wasn't moral, it was managerial. He even ended up in a concentration camp himself in 1944, suspected of links to the plot to assassinate Hitler. So, does this let him off the hook? In my view, absolutely not. It actually makes his story more instructive and in some ways more damning. Schacht represents the archetype of the enabler. He provided the Nazi regime with its single most precious commodity in its early years: credibility. His reputation as the savior of 1923 lent an air of respectability and competence to a gang of violent revolutionaries. He convinced the world, and crucially, Germany's industrial elites, that the Nazis could be trusted with the levers of a modern economy. He built the financial engine for rearmament, knowing full well it was illegal and would lead to international confrontation. He designed the system of controls that suppressed the German people's standard of living to feed the military. He created the economic architecture that made Hitler's dreams of conquest financially feasible in the short term. You cannot build the tracks and then express shock when the train, driven by a madman, heads for the cliff. Schacht's tragedy isn't that he was an innocent bystander. His tragedy is that he was a brilliant engineer who knowingly supplied a death machine with blueprints, believing he could somehow steer it. So, what do we take from this? The story of Hjalmar Schacht and the Nazi economic miracle is not a dusty history lesson. It's a cautionary tale with sharp relevance. It's a warning about the seduction of a political technocracy in an age of rising nationalism and great power competition. It reminds us that when someone promises a rapid, miraculous national restoration that defies economic gravity, we should look immediately for the hidden debts, the suppressed freedoms, and the human cost being swept under the rug. The miracle was always a fraud. It was built on hidden debt, wage suppression, and the systematic sacrifice of civilian well-being. And when those domestic tricks ran out, it sustained itself only through the two oldest and cruelest economic strategies in history, theft and slavery. It was, in the end, an economy built for one purpose, war. And when that war was over, it left Germany not restored and powerful, but utterly devastated, divided, and morally bankrupt. Schacht lived to be 93, a free man after the Nuremberg trials. If you found this deep dive into the mechanics of history and power useful, don't forget to subscribe, like, share, and hit the notification bell. This kind of analytical, long-form content depends on your support. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.